Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this lecture on the introduction to purchasing and supply management. My name is Holger Schiele. I'm a professor of purchasing and supply management at the University of Twente. And in this short lecture, I would like to give you a brief introduction to some major points on purchasing and supply management. All of this is based on this book, the Handbook of Operations, Logistics and Supply Chain Management, and to which I was invited to contribute with a short chapter on purchasing and supply management. And the following presentation is based on that chapter, and it joins this. So both of them are representing the complete event. Please read both, listen to the slides and read the chapter. Maybe a short objective. Why did I design or write this chapter? Well, the objective is to understand the importance of purchasing, to learn about the key concepts in purchasing and some definitions, learn the year cycle and a few key tools. Background to this idea was that here at the University of Twente, we have about 30 scholars researching and teaching and purchasing, actually one of the largest groups of the type in the world, presumably. And as a consequence, we also have more than a dozen courses. And not only in our master track, purchasing and supply management, but also many courses which are followed by students as an elective. And as such, it would make sense to just provide them some insights into really getting to the same level, to the same understanding to follow for the further courses. And that is exactly what the handbook is for. You see it here, the source, how you can cite it, purchasing supply management in these lecture notes of logistics, etc. Well, and what are the main elements? What is the content? First of all, we are briefly going to look at history and relevance of purchasing. Why the hell do we have to care about this topic at all? A few definitions and the main objectives of modern purchasing are then following. Then we will briefly touch upon a case which really transformed how we looked at purchasing, which is the case of Volkswagen. Then we discuss about purchasing situations roles, go quickly through the year cycle. So what is happening in purchasing throughout a year, touch upon theories, and then we look at one tool, which is the Kraljic-matrix, which is probably the most famous and most important tool in purchasing. So if you talk with purchasers, probably they know about this, or they use the terms out of this, which is why it is part of this standard introduction. And then finally, we touch upon the lever analysis, which is a tool to achieve cost savings, one of the most typical activities purchasers do. And finally, we have one little advanced topic and outlook, how to achieve competitive advantage as purchasing or from purchasing. And this is by trying to achieve preferred customer status. Now, when did purchasing start? Well, you see here probably the eldest purchasing textbook, which is the Railway Supplies from Kirkman, and published in 1887. So like many things, the interstate railways in the United States have had a big influence also on purchasing, because they were big organizations, so they needed to professionalize, and hence also professional purchasing department was implemented. Later, we have the interesting, and then for many times nothing happened, at least not that we would be aware of. Then comes this interesting article here of Mr. Redman. He argues that it would be regarded as a big mistake to neglect the significant advantage of a well-organized purchasing department. Further, he explains every experienced businessman will establish a purchasing department. Well, not all of them did. It took quite some time. Then we had the textbook R, which was published right after the war. That is this one here, the gray one. And as far as I know, the first professor who wrote a purchasing textbook, and if you happen to know maybe another language is someone earlier, just inform me, please. This is Mr. Zumthorf from the University of Göttingen, who in 1957 wrote this book. But as you already see, there are decades between these events, and there's also good reason for that. In the past, purchasing was not so important as it is now. As you see in this illustration, if you go half a century or a little bit more behind, then the wages, salaries, overheads of a firm were still by far the largest part of the total turnover. And the share of materials and hence of purchased goods, this has gradually been increasing throughout the years. Example here is the Volkswagen Beetle. You all know this little car. And when it was launched, Volkswagen would run their own farm on which it was breeding pigs, which they would transform into sausages. They had a canteen run by own employees, and there they would serve it to the workers. So the entire value chain, the entire supply chain within one company. Well, nowadays, they are obviously no longer the sausage altogether has gone a little bit out of fashion, but surely few companies would run their own canteen. They have outsourced this to a professional company which runs not only the canteen of one company, but of many, and hence are knowledgeable about how to do so. So this is their core competence. The core competency of a car company is to build cars, and there are certain elements of that, but not to make a sausage, right? But also the canteen company nowadays obviously does not have their own farm, but they buy the meat and the sausages, etc., etc. You get the point. A long value chain developed. We have been moving into a network economy. And whereas the Beetle was having like 15% purchased goods, I put here a picture of a modern car, the Porsche Cayenne, which is exactly mirroring this. 85% of the value is purchased there. So this is completely a different situation which emerged. And this is not a coincidence or a special case. If you take here the largest top Dutch companies as an example, on average, about 70% of all their costs are purchasing costs. Obviously, it depends a little bit on the industry. That's what we're seeing here, right? For example, this one here is a supermarket, and the supermarket has 90% or more as purchasing costs. It's clear, it's a trading company. And on the other end, we have a time labor company. The time labor company has as a main cost position salaries, right? And only buys a few office equipment and so on. But the normal company, as we see on this picture, there is no such thing as a normal company, but the average company spends about 70% of their costs in purchasing. And this means that purchasing must be managed professionally. Just look at this and try, if you have a little bit of time, try to calculate it yourself. Let's take a company here which wants to double its returns. So how much would this company have to reduce their purchasing costs to achieve a doubling of their return on assets, right? So you see here the sales of 1 million, total costs 950 million, and in here it is assumed that only half of the sales, that is 500,000, are actually purchasing costs. As we have seen in the previous picture, this is really the lower end of an average company. So just calculate how much the purchasing costs have to be reduced to duplicate this return on asset from 10 to 20%. Well, here is the answer, right? It's only 10%. About 10% the prices of purchased goods would have to be reduced in order to duplicate the profit or the assets, the return here. Why? Just look at this. The purchase cost of 500,000 go down by 50,000. Hence, they are only 900,000 instead of 950,000. With 1 million of sales, right? This continues in the same way, just that you pay less for your material. The profit soars from 50 to 100,000. Put this in relation to the sales of 1 million, you have a profit margin not of 5%, but of 10%, right? 100,000 divided through 1 million is 10%. And then add the asset part, because otherwise you can't really compare companies with low assets, such as a typical service company, and those with high assets, a mine or whatever. And here we have another influence. The inventory may probably also go down, or the cost of your inventory, because you paid less for that, right? So here also your turnover, investment turnover increases. Altogether, you are with roughly 10% less purchasing savings, or maybe it's 10% savings, you will achieve double of your returns. The other way around, if your purchasing does not work well, then you cannot really achieve very much. Just to summarize this point, or to explain this, take this 10% of earnings here, then add normal other costs, right? This here, the numbers I'm showing you are from my industrial company, right? 3 of them, and calculated the average. They have a few overheads, some cost of sales. In that case, they sell technical products, so there are some traveling salesmen. Finance is not too much, even more now that the interest rate is very low. R&D 8.5%, so it's a high-tech company, above 7.5%. Well, and then we come to the big cost block. Production, it's roughly 10%. That's what you see very often, 10, 12%. That is something what companies now have as production. That is, by the way, where most of the salaries end up of the company. Logistics costs, 1.5% was in that case. If you have containered serial production within Central Europe, you pay maybe as little as 0.5%. Of course, if you get it from China, then it is more expensive. But in that case, an average of 1.5%. So you are not going to save the company by reducing logistics costs, right? You're also not going to save the company by reducing production costs. If you want to reduce the costs by 10%, just to double your earnings, it has to become from purchasing. Here, in that case, 62.3%, right? So this is the typical value what we see most often. So if you want to rescue your company, you want to save your company, or you want to go to overtaking lane and make a good profit, then this is the area which has to be optimized in the first hand. It may be fair to have an interim conclusion. Companies exist by selling, but earn profits by purchasing. So now let's look at how good purchasing looks like, how this should be working. Definition and objectives. And just as a short remark, you can all find this in the book here in this chapter. Of course, you don't have to read the entire thing, only just a small chapter. You may also be able to download it via your library. It's thanks to this lecture note, the technology, you can also get just a chapter. Let's start about purchasing, not shopping, right? That's another story. We need to have a professional approach to that. Purchasing is responsible for acquiring all the materials needed by an organization and the related activities like organizing the flow of knowledge, goods, services, payments, and materials, right? Important point here, everything where money goes out of the firm to another entity, that is a purchase good. and that should be managed by purchasing, by the purchasing department. From the definitions, we have to distinguish again between two parts, and this is very important to understand what's going on. We have on the one hand the strategic sourcing. That means planning supply, how much you need, selecting the supplier, negotiating, etc., etc., and finally contracting. So this part we call strategic sourcing, making the choice and getting a contract with your supplier. And then we have the operative procurement. This is like ordering the material, expediting the order, that is making sure that it's really coming and calling, where is it, routed here and there, logistic activities, right? And eventually paying the delivery if it arrived on time correctly, etc. So that's what we call operative procurement. These words are used differently. Also in the United States and in Europe, there are some deviations. We suggest, however, to use these words because they are very practice-proof. There is e-procurement software which covers exactly this operative procurement part here, and sourcing software which covers exactly the sourcing part. Therefore, it makes sense to make this a distinction. And altogether, we're talking about purchasing. So, what are the objectives of purchasing? If you look into one of these elder books from 1957 and others, they will typically name 3 objectives: the right product, the right quality at the appropriate costs. So that means here safe supply, ensuring delivery. That is obviously one of the core objectives of purchasing activity. The second is the quality, right? It must be okay. It must be exactly complying to what we want. And please notice that this quality term nowadays is broader. It is not only including technical quality, but you may also include elements such as environmental quality, that your supply chain fulfills the required environmental standards. Right? So this is all part of the quality. The costs. All right. If you cannot comply to the required costs, obviously the company cannot continue. So there is no discussion that the costs are important and maybe a prime objective of purchasing. And please notice, that's why it's written here, costs are a little bit more than price. They include, for example, the logistics cost, but also the costs of use. So if some people need it's complicated to use this and they spend a lot of time or need a lot of education, etc., etc. All of this has to be included in the cost of acquisition, the total cost of ownership, which we also take into consideration. And recently, in the last 1-2 decades, 2 other elements have become prominent, namely innovation. All right, we saw since the 1990s a fundamental change. Innovations more often than not are done by suppliers, not in the laboratory of a customer, of a buying company. And hence, collaborating with suppliers in innovation has become a very important aspect, right? And that is why purchasers more and more get also this as a target, as an objective, innovations from and with suppliers. And last not least, achieving a competitive advantage. If purchasing is responsible for 70% of the costs, it is quite reasonable to think if you manage this better and you can outperform your competitors on the supply market, you may achieve a sustainable advantage difficult for others to follow. So these are the objectives of purchasing. Of course, the traditional objectives: safe supply, good quality, including nowadays a broad quality understanding, including sustainability and social aspects and the like. Costs, total cost, please consider innovation, and you may want to achieve a strategic benefit. Right? All of this is just to repeat, explained more in detail here in the in the handbook. You can read this more in detail. This is just a small summary. Now, the case of Volkswagen, which we would like to put in here and introduce at this moment of time. The reason why this case has been introduced here is just to illustrate a little bit how it can make a change. And Volkswagen is also so far famous because many things which have been developed here and there have been introduced there together, and really that made a difference, made them the largest car company in the world. And this is quite well documented. For example, in this book here, which is the biography of Ferdinand Piëch. Please note the two dots on the E, otherwise it would be Piëch, but it is Piëch, so you should try to place these dots here. He assumed the management of the Volkswagen Group, but he has a special thing. Before that, he was responsible for purchasing at Audi. And so purchasing manager becoming the boss of the company. And what he had learned there, and I quote from his book, because this is very central also for the pooling aspect, which we're going to discuss later. He said, I only had to calculate if we just threw out the smaller tires in the Audi 100, we would reach volume leadership against Daimler and BMW. And Audi can largely dictate the driving properties of the tires. This is how the idea was born. So the idea of pooling and the idea of modularizing the car, right? All Audi cars and later also a couple of Volkswagen had the same size of tires. And by this, he could get better prices from the suppliers because he could not buy a few 100,000, but millions of them. And at the same time, also progress innovation and develop and co-develop these parts in the way they wanted. And other car companies had to follow this. So this is a little bit more than just cutting the prices, right? And then the story goes when Piëch assumed the leadership of the Volkswagen Group, which was not doing very well at that time. He said, if we want to be the best car company and the largest, that is what he wanted and achieved, the largest car company, we need to have the best purchaser. And that was José López, as he assumed this to be, and probably was some kind of right. But the problem was that Mr. López was working for General Motors, so exactly the rival. And then, but she also explains quite nicely in his book, then a big, almost like a detective story struggle happened to bring over Mr. López from a GM to work for Volkswagen, which in the end succeeded. He came together with a couple of other people, which helped to build up the new organization. GM was very unhappy. They sued them, lawsuits, long story. After a couple of years, Volkswagen had to pay about 100 million euros and buy parts from GM. But probably it was worth this effort, because what did he do? And I'm just highlighting a few aspects. There are much more. There's also a book on that, Revolution in Purchasing, by a guy called Versteeg, which was also one of them. Read this if you want to go more into detail. But for example, one thing which they did and which nowadays is very much popular, they introduced a matrix organization. So in the old days, each factory would have their own purchasing department. But now what they say is they introduce a commodity council. I mean, this is a group so that they can jointly buy all the elements. And this was necessary because this modularization strategy, which Piëch introduced, right, using the same parts for many, many different types of cars, this was only possible if the organization of the purchasing department would be different, right? So that is why here we see that this strategy could only be realized by the purchasing department being modified and modernized. Matrix organization was introduced. The next element, advanced sourcing, right? We have discussed that parts are very often developed by the suppliers. So in order to get what you really want, you have to co-develop it. And you cannot wait, like in the older days, that engineering personnel design a product, then shifts the plan over to purchasing, then ask to buy it. This does not work. Now, the new thing what they introduce is that the purchasers are members of this new product development team, jointly work this. It has also another big advantage. In this way, over-engineering can be avoided. Over-engineering means just developing something for the sake of technology, but not for a commercial reason, right? And just one last point to highlight here of this revolution in purchasing which occurred there is the module sourcing. So rather than buying small little pieces and assembling all of this in the factory, they went over to buy entire modules components, such as not tires, screws, etc., but an entire wheel or entire driving system. This is also something which has been a trend in industry, which explains also again a little bit why the depth of production has gone down, right? And the Volkswagen Beetle time, not only did they have their own pigs, but the thing what they bought was a little bit like metal sheets, and then they transformed all of them, all pieces made in one factory. And nowadays you get components which you just put together. Much more efficient, much more cheap, but requiring moving from simple ordering to strategic planning, because otherwise it doesn't work. So just as a short teaser, you see how important purchasing is. It was a revolution, and Volkswagen had the target to be the #1 company in 2018. It achieved this already in 2016, so a little bit ahead of plan. And it's of course a process not of a few years, but of many years, more than a decade. But purchasing really made the difference here. And that is what we're seeing in more and more companies. All right, how to accomplish this? Purchasing situations and roles. Again, a few pieces of definition. What are the purchasing situations? Here are some terms which you need to know if you want to become a purchaser or if you want to talk to purchasers. First big difference, direct material and indirect material. And please notice that material also always could be called services, right? It is a good which you buy. If you are a service company, then it's of course services. But we talk typically about direct material. Direct materials are those that contribute to the final product a company provides. Hence, it is built into this product and disappears. The indirect material is everything which you need to produce your final product, but which the customer does not see. Think here about, for example, all your administration and what they need, the computers, office equipment, but also insurances, marketing, etc., etc. All of these are indirect materials. First big distinction, and we come back to this in a moment when we look at the different roles purchasers take over, because it's very different to buy. The direct materials, you can calculate them. Take the case of the car. If one car is sold, automatically then we'll need to have 4 tires and maybe 5 if there's a reserve tire. So you just have to calculate this. Once the sales order is in, you can automatically order your tires and whatever you need with your suppliers. You can automatize this. Indirect material very often happens to be bought spontaneously or in periods. You do not know when the computer of someone is going to break, right? That is why suddenly, or when a new employee comes, so then you will order a new computer. This leads us to also the second distinction here between serial parts and spot or project materials. Again, a big difference. Serial parts, you know this, you have planned them in advance. And spot buys are things which you suddenly need. Your crane has broken well, then you suddenly need a crane, but you are not planning this, right? Or project, think about building a big ship or a harbor or a plant, right? These are projects, also quite a different thing, because you do it once, but not every time, and not 100,000 and thousands of times. So this is a big difference in when ordering this. Think about the relationship between your suppliers and you. And then finally, another dimension which you may take into consideration, the rebuy of an existing product. This is obviously much easier because you have already bought it. Or the first buy of a new product. Here also include all these new product development activities, right? And of course, you can combine this. You have a direct material and a serial product for a serial product for the first time, which is being developed, right? So this is the type of a purchasing situation. Or you may have an indirect material which you buy on the spot, and it's the same as every time. So then you may go to, for example, electronic marketplaces or things like that. Depending on how the situation is, different activities and different skills are also needed. And that is why another important message. There is no thing as the purchaser anymore. The more that this function has developed, the more it became differentiated in different roles. So for example, we have the purchaser for direct material or for indirect material, right? They need different skills. The direct material purchaser, for example, needs to interact with R&D people or with production logistics, right? Much more than the one with indirect. So it needs to have a different background. The indirect purchaser, however, is responsible for material, for a commodity, which you cannot plan that easily. So it needs better planning, better activities, skills on that area. Then we have the operative procurement. Typically, this, remember, when we distinguish between strategic sourcing and operative procurement, this should not be in one person, because then they will just spend their time with operative activities and not to really have time to prepare the strategic sourcing, prepare the negotiation, and essentially achieve a lot of savings. So that's why this is more often than not nowadays split. Public procurement is a new and emerging role. The more we are buying from public authorities or in the public authorities, the more we need special skills. For example, there are the EU tendering laws, right? And that is exactly what the public procurement agent needs to know. Different roles. Procurement engineer, right, is doing the interface with R&D, and a couple of other roles. Just to illustrate this, let's take here the organigram of a, like say, very typical or maybe leading purchasing organization of a technical company here, right? They produce electronic parts. So first of all, we have here the commodity groups: commodity management electronics and commodity management mechanics, mechatronics. And then you have here the ASICs, micro, storage, displays. These are all elements or materials, electronic materials. And what we also see here on this, this picture is that for each type of material, which we call a commodity, someone is responsible, right? Someone is responsible for the ASICs, another one just buys circuits, another one inductors, then there's someone for plastics or for the indirects and so on. This is very important. And this is also where purchasing is distinguishing itself from many other functions, because it's organized according to commodities, which are similar goods purchased at one supply market. Why wouldn't we suggest that on each project, one purchaser is buying, let's say, relays, switches, circuits, inductors, etc.? The answer is very simple. The purchaser has to specialize, needs to know about the market, needs to know all players, needs to know the product, and needs to know the prices, etc. and needs to get knowledge about all the volumes which the company is working for is charging, is needing, right? Only then can the complete purchasing power be used, and then only good prices, good delivery conditions, and so on are being possible. So very important point here, looking at the organization structure, commodities are the thing to work with. So, and therefore this company here, about 30-35 people working there, has distinguished this, and each purchaser is responsible for one or maybe two commodities. Then they have the factories, the operative procurement locations at here, Germany 1, 2, 3, Austria, Italy, and in China. Remember, that's what I said, distinguishing between strategic sourcing, that is what the people here in the commodity management do. They make the contracts for a year very often. And then here, depending on how much of these materials is needed in the factory, the operative part, withdrawing these materials, making sure that they're coming, etc., etc., and of course, troubleshooting is done at the factory side. This has turned out to be the most convenient thing, not centralized, because then the people at the factory will not believe that the centralized people are acting on their behalf. A new department which has been introduced here, procurement engineering. Actually, I have been working on this and designing this purchasing department here in a consulting project, which I did before joining academia. It was very difficult. It took a couple of years to implement this procurement engineering department, because these are special people, specially skilled people, which make the interface between technology and the R&D department and their colleagues of the commodity management, right? For each product line, someone is responsible. And if the product line A80, I anonymize it a little bit, needs some relays, then he talks to the guy who is responsible for the relays and bring him on the project to work with that. But after that has been solved, then this person cannot be present all the time on each project. So that's why we need a procurement engineer, a new development. And last but not least, and that's again something which you see very often, a department, something called like systems and strategy, where you find the controlling activities, which we're going to see later when we look at the year cycle. The IT tools, more and more important, processes, risk management, all of this is typically concentrated at a specialized small department. Okay, but I hope it became clear what we have been discussing here, the different roles, the commodity manager roles for direct, this is mostly direct and indirect, the operative purchaser, procurement engineers, a couple of other roles. By the way, yes, it's the same word here. Sometimes they're also called advanced sourcers, the procurement engineers, depending on the naming. And just to sum this up, a little bonus material, which you do not find in the handbook because it's absolutely new. Of course, these roles are evolving. We have now the Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution, new technologies coming up, much more data being available, and this is also adding new roles to purchasing. We made a large EU project, which you see here, and people already start to implement special data analysts, which just work with the amount of purchasing data which are available as a novel technology to identify them and to analyze them. This doesn't work if you don't have a good master data manager which cares for the quality of data, shit in, shit out. Processes are being automated very often. Robotic process automation is here. And it turned out that this is a job, this is a role, someone specialized on that. And so it goes on. And maybe here the last one, new role, the legislation specialist. Also getting more and more important. I've already mentioned this new target or objective, environmental, social aspects, right? And this is also moving over often coming from the United States, where this has been much earlier. We know about companies there, which out of the 30 people in their purchasing department, 2 of them are actually what we would call legislation specialists. They check if this company complies to all rules and regulations, environment, minorities, and so on and so on. So this is possibly a new role which is emerging more and more also over here. So what we're telling you is not static, right? It's an evolving field that's developing, and in particular, also the 4.0 technologies are propelling it and changing it in ever increasing pace. Now, let's look at the year cycle of purchasing. What does it mean? Let's briefly run through the typical activities of a purchasing department in a modern firm, what they do throughout the year. It's kind of a cycle, right? Because many activities are repeating. We try to depict this in 3 cycles, which you also find in the handbook here on page number 55. Essentially, the purchasing function department connects the firm to the supply market, right? So the firm might have a strategy and budgeting and planning. This influences the planning of the purchasing department for the next year. Then we have the category sourcing cycle, which executes this and links to the supply market, which basically means finding suppliers, selecting them, contracting them, working with them, and also discontinuing the working with them, phasing out. So every year, people might want to analyze the demand. So they have a demand planning, develop a strategy per category, select the suppliers, contract them, execute this, and evaluate this. Evaluate whether it worked quite well. Let's have a little bit of a closer look at these steps. And again, you can read them in the handbook. Demand planning, very important, because you need to know as good as possible how much of a certain commodity you're going to need. Why is this so? The more you as a buyer can promise to the supplier and be a reliable partner about how much volumes you're going to need when, the more the supplier can plan its own production, right? And then it's getting cheaper and more comfortable and more scheduled and no waste on capacity or materials. That is why a good demand planning together with the sales department is necessary. And I would like to highlight the next thing, category strategy. Very often you see that this is neglected. People are killed by the operative activities. Therefore, a short list of what elements should be part of our category strategy. Imagine you are responsible for a certain commodity. Would it be the relays or ASICs or whatever? You have to define the value creation model. First of all, make, buy, or cooperate. You're going to make it yourself. It is possible, of course, not very typical, but you can also. This is the first decision that has to be taken. You have to buy it or jointly something, cooperation. Then the sourcing object, right? Are you going to buy a raw material? Think about the pigs. You're buying some kind of assembled component, the sausage. It does sound a little bit strange, but you see that this is a unit. or the complete system, which in that case would be outsourcing the entire canteen service with all the food supplied, right? What is your sourcing object? Supply chain model, stock, demand tailored just in time. This has to be decided. Yeah? Do you put it on storage? Depending on what is the choice here for this strategy, completely different systems have to be implemented. A key point, the next one here, amount of suppliers. There are benefits of concentrating all on one supplier, right? You know each other better, the volume is larger. But of course, there are also advantages of having several. If one supplier fails or goes bankrupt, imagine you have a single source and that single source goes out of business. So a big issue, how many suppliers? Another thing, locational concept. Where are you going to buy your materials? Locally, globally, dispersed, maybe following currency areas. So there is a big issue about which influences your strategy. The pooling concept, we already mentioned this in the Volkswagen case. How are you going to leverage all the power of your organization, the diverse factories maybe? But please notice that pooling can also be outside, right? Diverse municipalities buying together. This is also pooling. Now they remain independent, but why not buy their corporate cars or computers or whatever jointly? And finally, how are you going to achieve this? For that, we are going to discuss the sourcing levers, which are exactly the operative tricks to achieve that. So a good category strategy answers these questions and updates them and executes them, right? So once you have analyzed your demand, which is a precondition of making category strategy, then you go to the supplier selection, right? This is exactly one of the core activities. How much volume will which supplier get for which commodity of yours? This is then in the end leading to contracts, right? With serial parts, relatively easy. You may make an annual contract or even longer. Of course, when demand is not that well known, then these contracts also happen throughout the year. But ideally, you make a frame contract, right? And then comes the execution, right? This is what we have been looking at the operative procurement. Throughout the year, identifying how many units are needed, ordering them, making sure that they come to the place where they are needed, complaining, and making also sure that this material has been paid at the end. And last not least, often forgotten, but very important, evaluating, right? You should not order material from a bad supplier a second time, provided you have other ones. So that doesn't make sense. So evaluation, supplier evaluation, that is how the circle is ended. And this supplier evaluation you will need again as an input for your next year supply selection. And now let's move at what we call the purchasing department cycle. The category sourcing cycle, that is what happens at each category, each material group, each buyer does this. Now this one here is at the entire department level. Let's start with the controlling and strategic planning input. This is such an example of a strategic plan. Many companies do such plans here. I have been involved in the design of many of them. A big fight and a big trouble, obviously. And in the end, how does it work? So you start here on the left side. This is the turnover old of a company and the costs which they had in the last year, right? Typically, you start with your annual planning based on last year's situation. Then you may have some changes in the product, right? If you discontinue the production of certain product line, well, then obviously this volume has to be taken out of your planning. Then there may be some other cost reductions which occurred, raw material prices going up and down, etc., etc. And then let's keep this yellow part open for a moment. Then you come up with the costs of constant quantity, right? If nothing else would happen. Then you may sell maybe a little bit more, that is the volume change here. And then you have some target costs. And then the company makes a promised profit, right? And this now gets the new target turnover. And now an iteration process starts. Typically, a company may start with the promised profit. How much profit are they going to promise, right? In their turnover, so and so many millions are profit. That's what, for example, the stock market expects. Hence, you get some target costs. How much can you afford? Taking the volume changes, then you come to a target cost. Yeah, and here you saw the old costs, the cost reduction of some other departments, and a big quantity of savings is typically left over, and that is what purchasing has to deliver. Remember that 70% of the costs are within the purchasing department. So normally in all of these annual plannings, if purchasing is not able to guarantee that the supplied goods are of the respective price, they will never make the promised profit. So they will start every year again to look at how are they going to achieve these savings, right? For that, later got a suggestion here from us how to do this to complement your planning with the lever analysis. But just to make sure here, and we are here at this department cycle. It's linked to the firm strategy and corporate budgeting. The controlling and strategic planning of the purchasing department will play a role. Just to illustrate this, how it is linked. We have the firm strategy, which, for example, includes this general planning and the promise towards stock market or wherever. Then we have functional strategies, for example, the purchasing strategy, what we have just discussed. But of course, R&D, engineering, marketing, etc., all of these functions will also have their own strategy, which they have to take into consideration. And then we break this down to the category strategies, right? This is something which exists only at purchasing. Each purchaser responsible for a certain category tries to find his or her contributions, like how they're going to achieve these cost targets. For that, sourcing levers can be used, like finding new suppliers, reducing costs by auctions or whatever, changing the product, etc., etc. So this is a lot of ideas which have to be creative. And finally, you have to break down this towards each supplier and develop a tactic how that supplier can contribute to this overall target. So that is the strategic planning once you have explained how you're going to do this, right? In the end of this process, of the planning process, people know what they should do throughout the year to achieve the plan. As long as nothing goes wrong, they will achieve it. And a good controller makes always a rolling forecast so that you can see if something goes out of control, and then you make corrective actions. For that, having said this, you may want to have to change your processes, the process organization. Number 4 here, very often IT processes. They are so important that they got an own box here in this department cycle. Most likely this is at department level because the software will be used by many, many commodities. That is why it's not at the category sourcing cycle. The department has to constantly update their software environment. And this is getting more and more in the last years with a lot of startups bringing new software which help them to do the work on the market. but they need to be implemented, right? Maybe this changes has to change the structure, the organization. They have to do a pooling organization, or maybe just decentralize or whatever. And finally, staffing. You need to have people doing this job. That is why we are trying to educate the people, right? And this is also part here of the annual planning. How many people will you need, with which skills, and how the existing people can acquire the necessary skills to do so. Okay, then you run your plan, you evaluate here, you control it, you check it, and then you see what you have been learning, and you start the planning next year again, maybe even more accurate than before. So this is, in essence, the purchasing year cycle. Just summarizing, linked to the targets of the overall company, typically the cost targets, because 70% of the costs, or 60%, are from purchasing. For that, a very thorough planning has to be done at each commodity, and then jointly for the entire group, the entire department. And each commodity, they take over this demand at their share, which they have to fulfill, develop their commodity strategy, breaking this down to each supplier and each activity, what they're going to do in order to achieve this, contract the supplier, execute this activity, and evaluate whether it worked out or not in order to make it better the next year. That is the purchasing cycle. Now, having said this, now come the theories. Why would the theories of purchasing, or grand theories which help purchasing, there are few of them genuinely purchasing categories, why do they come here at this point? Well, because they can help a lot with this purchasing year cycle. The handbook selects a few theories. None of them is an all-comprehensive theory, but each of them contributes a little bit to be a better purchaser. For example, let's start with the transaction cost economics. Transaction cost economics by the Nobel laureate course and Williamson later, they argue that once you make a business transaction, for example, buying something, you have transaction costs. And if these transaction costs, the cost of buying, let's say like searching for your partner, contracting this partner, right? If they are very, very complicated and high, then you better make it yourself. So this transaction cost economics alerts people to look at transaction costs, to calculate them, and to make this decision correctly. If it's too complicated to buy something, then try to build it yourself. Another theory is the resource dependency theory. Pfeffer-Stalansik, 1978, launched a book in which they simplified, right? I'm really simplifying these theories a little bit, but in very simple terms, they say, if two companies interact with each other and one is more dependent on the other than the other way around, that means which we have a power hierarchy, the more dependent company will have less privilege compared to the more powerful company. Seems logic, right? At least if your assumption is that of a zero-sum game or a non-collaborative game. And then they conclude, try not to be dependent too much on partners. This obviously has an influence on the question, how many suppliers should we have, right? This category strategy. Relational view of the firm. This is maybe the only grand theory which has developed in the purchasing field. So Dyer and Singh, who published this around 2000, late 90s, they have been doing research in the automotive industry in purchasing. And they discover that the way how you interact with your suppliers, that this creates value. The 1 + 1 is 3 effect, relational value, relational economies, or relational rents, as they call it. All right. So you need to have an adequate governance structure. They make some proposals on how to achieve this. Important point with the relational view of the firms, which is one of the big strategic views, is that it links purchasing to strategic management, right? If you do not have partners, and if you cannot bend to them, then you cannot achieve relational rents. And hence, you will be less successful and achieve less competitive strategy. The relational view of the firm. Principal agent theory, very applicable. The principal is the buying company, and the agent is the one which delivers it. Now, if, for example, there is a complete intransparency and you cannot see what your agent is doing, there is a danger that the agent is committing moral hazard. So promises more than actually is delivering. You do not know what is inside. Right? We have some parts where we cannot understand from outside if the quality is correct. So sometimes you have to break the component just to check whether inside the quality is okay. Now, principal agent theory discusses like how can you reduce this probability that your agent, your supplier, is behaving in a way which you do not anticipate, which you did not like, right? Of course, creating transparency is one of the tools. And that is what principal agent theory is about, to implement systems which are by itself so stable that you got what you get to be promised for. Two more theories, social capital theory. I think it's one of the most practical theories. It essentially says you have relational capital, how your relationship is, cognitive capital, how similar the buyer and suppliers are. And you also have the structural capital. That means, for example, the systems, the computer linkages, but also the meetings which you organize with your business partners. And the more relational capital you have, the better you can collaborate. Works quite well, and it gives also an idea of arguing if something is not working. Can't we collaborate with the supplier because we are too different? Cultural issues, that's something with the cognitive capital. Is it maybe that our relationship is bad? Then let's work on this relationship, meet them, fly there, and so on. Or is it that our systems are not linked? Then implement an EDI, electronic data exchange, or a collaborative development software, or something like this. All out of this theory. And last but not least, game theory. Game theory helps a lot with negotiations, right? One of the activities purchasers do. And as the name says, it comes from, they try to understand games. These games which you play like Monopoly and so on. Then it turned out that this is really a science, and you can really develop complicated theories on that. One of them is a victory auction, or auctions in general, which comes out of this. The victory auction is particularly interesting if you do not know very well how much something is going to cost. You can apply this. You're asking the suppliers to make an offer with their best price. But the winner of this victory auction will not be the supplier with the absolutely lowest price, but or he will get the job, of course, but he will earn as much money as the second has charged. Imagine you want to buy something, you don't know about a good price, and one says 105 and the other 100 and the other something different, then you will actually award it to the supplier who gave the best price, but you will not pay him 100 but 105. This sounds strange at the first argument, But this is so because in this way, the supplier has the maximum incentive to get the job and offer the highest price, the best price he can to do, because he knows he will not really have to pay. He will get a little bit more money than that one. And this he has an incentive to offer the best price. So this is this Vickery auction. Interesting story here is that Mr. Vickery gained the Nobel Prize for that, but later they found out that even Goethe had already applied this technology, right? So he went, he did not really know about the value of a price, so he used a notary, all right, and asked the editors to make an offer for buying his most recent piece of work in sealed envelopes, right? And the notary would open them. So that was already 200 years before game theory applied, but he did not know about this theory and intuitively invented something like this, which nowadays we have as game theory. And just to summarize this, that is what why we need some kind of a theory management or why theories in supply be helpful, because we don't want to do this intuitively, right, and wait for another 200 years till someone applies this idea, but we want to do this systematically and always when it's adequate. And that's what these theories can be helpful with. So look at them. The handbook is just giving some kind of teasers, but maybe they will also be helpful from situation to situation. Well, we're now coming to the second and concluding part of this introduction, and which we are looking for some very important tools, very helpful and very useful tools. And the most important is the Kraljic-matrix. The other day, a training for startups, right? Around of our university in Twente, we have a lot of startups, incubators. That is one of the specialities here at this place. And so we try to educate them, the founders, what they need to know about purchasing. And well, I thought the Kraljic-matrix is too complicated for such small companies, so I've been discussing about construct and so on. But in the end, then someone complained and said, but what about the Kraljic-matrix? Don't you want to explain this to us? So I had heard about this. So of course, we don't want you to come in this situation that you don't know what the Kraljic-matrix is. Most famous instrument of all in purchasing. This is Mr. Kraljic, who has invented the Kraljic-matrix. He has been consultant at McKinsey and was at a project with one of the big chemical companies in Germany. I once met him where he told the story, like how he invented this matrix. So back in 1973, so many years ago, they were running a project there. And suddenly the customer said, yeah, but we also want to do something for purchasing. Never before had they done too many purchasing projects, right? Again, a typical situation as a consultant. I have worked for many years as a consultant before going to university. I perfectly know the situation in which Peter Kraljic was in before, and many of you might also know this. Next morning, the customer expects some miracles from you, but you don't really, you're not prepared for that because nobody asked for that before, or the situation is new. So Mr. Kraljic was laying in his bed, could not really sleep, and then he had the idea, because nobody of his colleagues could help him, right? And this was 40 years ago, you could not send an email around of the world or look in the archives. He was all alone, had to figure out something. And then his idea was to say, in the early 70s, everybody was talking about the Boston consulting matrix, right? Popularized by a competing company to the one where Mr. Kraljic was working for. You know, this where you make a matrix, you have to be market leader and in a growing market, and that's where you position your business units. And Peter then thought, okay, let's transfer this idea to the purchasing environment. And that's how the matrix was born. So that is the inspiration. I will explain in a moment how the matrix looks like, just to finish this anecdote. The next morning they implemented this, or started to implement this, and they ran through all their materials, and it was a big success. They were very happy with him. He also made a big career in the company, and they were so happy that they did not allow him to publish this until 4 years later, because they thought it was such a competitive advantage which they might have achieved through that. So back in 1977, he then published in German language a paper, which is still, I think, much better than the one which eventually made spread around the world in 1983 in Harvard Business Review, which is a little bit complicated. But the original one from 1977 in a practitioner's magazine is quite clear. It essentially says the following, and these are terms which you need to know, but you will listen, you hear them again and again and again. Essentially, it is about how strong are you as a buyer, that is the y-axis, and how strong is the seller, the x-axis. There are some tricks how you can measure this, right? The size of your volume, that's how you operationalize this matrix, whether you are working as a consultant and consulting people, or if you are a purchaser and you have to place your commodity in this matrix. How much you purchase, how much percentage of the volume of your suppliers, right? All of this gives you an indication how important you are, what is your power. On your side, how much important is this material impact on the final product, and so on. At the same time, you analyze how strong the seller is. Is this material very unique? Are other suppliers available? Think about this story about how many suppliers you want to qualify. Are there substitutions, plastic instead of wood, for example, things like that. Now, and then 4 situations occur. The most favorite is the leverage category. I mean, you are strong as a buyer, supplier is relatively weak. Well, that is where you can exploit your full purchasing power. That's where, for example, some type of auctions happen. That's where you can have many suppliers, you ask them, you negotiate hard with them, etc. Other situation is that one here, you are unimportant, supplier is also unimportant. That's what we call a non-critical category, or also called a routine category. Think about the classic thing, office supplies. Not even a large multinational company is very important for an office supply company, right? There are hundreds of them. The other way around, office equipment, material, paper, pens, whatever, is also offered by many other companies. So in both cases, there's no importance on each side. What you can do here is not so much about the price, because you do this as well, but you try to standardize the process, reduce the process costs, right? Rather than calling somewhere just to buy a pencil, make it an electronic system, right? That's what brings the savings here. strategic categories. This is very nice. Both our partners are important for each other. Strategic collaboration. And very unpleasant, the bottleneck category. So you are not important. Supplier has all the power. Think about the rare earth. That was the case. In that situation, you just have to try to secure the material or replace it. Just a small illustrative example of placing categories within the Kraljic-matrix. This is the example here from a power plant. And they have some leverage categories, such as fuel, telecommunication, right? They are an interesting customer, large company, a big power. It's not very important for them, leverage category. And then they have a routine category here. For example, chemical laboratory equipment, right? Of course, they have a laboratory to test things, but they are not very important for that. And there are many, they are not very sophisticated either. So there are many suppliers for that. It's a routine good. Or whatever here, office equipment, like always. Strategic goods, for example, here, professional services, the maintenance services, that is a typical win-win situation. They need a lot of maintenance for this power plant equipment. And these companies which do the maintenance have to be local often, so they may not be very large. This is where you can have a strategic partner. And these power plants often talk about the investment goods like reactors as a bottleneck good, right? Because there are only, in many of these segments, only 2 or 3 big suppliers in the world which produce them, and hundreds of power plants. So this is a classical bottleneck. The other day, one CPO of one of the largest power companies told me, these are the big fat cats, right? So she did not apparently like them because they can often dictate the prices. That's the classical bottleneck. All right. So this is a tool, very helpful to think about the category, to organize this, to include this, and to design a strategy. And just one concluding word of caution, and I hope that I also included this here in this, because yes, it is here. We have analyzed this. They are very widely used, this categorization, the Kraljic-matrix. Everybody talks about it's a bottleneck material, and then everybody runs out of the building, doesn't want to work with you if you are responsible for bottleneck material, right? But the theory of Mr. Kraljic said or suggests that's an either-or, that you are either, when you are in strategic department, you would only do strategic levers. No, this is not the case. What we see is an add-on. Even if you're responsible for strategic commodity, obviously you're trying to apply all the cost reduction levers, but on top, try to collaborate with other people. That's at least what empirically is the case. Only with the routine goods, there are very, very few activities, levers applied, process improvement, but they do not try to be strategic partners, right? So it's not an either-or, but it's more an additional and add-on what these recommendations help you. So now you are possibly now in the situation that you start your first job as a purchaser. You're responsible for any particular category, and you have some targets. And how are you going to achieve this? That's where the lever analysis is going to help you. How to achieve cost targets. This is a systematic tool which collects the tricks purchasers use to achieve their targets. The other way around, if you are listening to our presentation and you are actually a salesperson, listen good, because these here are the tricks which they try to reduce the price with you and get better conditions, etc., etc. So let's look, how are these tricks? This is a collection of tricks, the lever analysis, right? That's exactly the point. You can make a nice category strategy, which you should, but how are you then going to operationalize this? This is the tactics, the levers. And what are the levers? We distinguish between two broad types of levers, which we call commercial lever and cross-functional. The commercial lever is using your advantage. If you are powerful, then you can use them. Driven by purchasing. It's about volume bundling, buying together. It's about price evaluation. Think about auctions and whatever, how to drive the price down. It's about extension of supply base. This increases your competitive position. If you have some new suppliers, some more suppliers, then you can negotiate better with your existing suppliers. And then we have the cross-functional levers. This is about obtaining advantages which have not been there before. Most often you will need, as a buyer, to collaborate in that case with other functions. For example, if we talk about the product optimization, then this is obviously something where R&D is running an important part of the show. Here it is the question of improving the product. Think about this. If you take out some material, these are immediate savings. It's not harmful also for the supplier. If instead of 260 grams, you only need 200 grams of a certain metal, it does not hurt, but it saves a lot of money, namely the cost of 60 grams of metal. So that's what you do with the product optimization. Process improvement, we have already talked about that. And optimization of the supplier relationship, maybe some new contracts and so on. And there is one which we call category spanning optimization, because a word of caution. I've told you that the category is the golden standard in purchasing, right? You should not have an organization, at least in most cases, where one buyer is responsible for everything, because you cannot specialize on anything. But there's obviously also a danger. If you are responsible as a buyer for just one category and don't look left and right, you may optimize your category but cause extra costs with someone else. Or the other way around, maybe someone can help you to reduce your costs. Think about buying cheap paper for a printer, which then needs more ink. So if we have a category paper and a category ink, and they don't talk to each other, there may be some disadvantages, some dangers, some errors occurring. The other way around, if they talk to each other, they may achieve additional savings. That's what the category spanning optimization is all about. In the following 7 slides, I'm briefly going to address a few of these levers. Right, this is the result. This version, there are many lever models out there in the market. A couple of books which try to summarize them. What we did was we did an empirical analysis which of these levers in that company where we have been work better, and that is how they have been selected. But it does not mean that they are true for all companies. Depending on what your company is doing, other sourcing levers may be more or less of importance. But we are just giving you an insight on some of these levers for you to have a suggestion and an idea what is meant with that. And maybe you apply some of them. Of course, you find also the reference to the paper where you can dive more into detail, and a little bit is also written in the handbook. How does a lever analysis work? 2 ways. Number 1, a purchaser does it all alone. It's a creativity tool for the purchaser to identify potential projects which help to achieve the targets. Variation 2, runs a cross-functional lever workshop, inviting colleagues which have to do with the material and jointly look for improvement opportunities. In our paper from 2010, I think Horn, Schiele, Voss, we have analyzed 150 such cross-functional lever workshops, which have been documented by the consultancy where I've been working with H and Z. So when I was there, I asked everybody to write down the results of these lever workshops, and then we analyzed them. The interesting finding is that each of these levers works, right? Depending on the company. In no company you will, or no category, you will apply all 7 levers at the same time. Even more, you should not do so, because some are contradicting to each other. Either you do a global sourcing and outsourcing, you go to a new country, or you do an innovation and product improvement. This is empirically shown that is a trade-off. It doesn't really work to just find a new supplier somewhere where you have never been, and then expect this one also collaborates with your engineers and you find a product improvement. On average, sometimes it may work, but on average, our research has shown it does not. Now, if you do it correctly, you run a lever workshop like that one here. You prepare all the data, of course, for your commodity group, what you want to achieve. And then you discuss with them one by one the levers. You invite people from quality, from logistics, from technology, production. This obviously depends on what you are responsible for. If your commodity is marketing services, obviously you may not need logistics personnel present, but you obviously ask the marketing people to join the lever workshop. And then you ask them simply, okay, do we have any possibilities for pooling of demand? Do you know of anybody else using this material? Okay, and then you write down all these ideas. In the end, you get a long list of ideas of what you could do in order to achieve the target of typically reducing costs. Of course, the target can also be to generate innovation or whatever, but let's stick to that, what is most often happening. Then you can generate a long list and realize the best ideas throughout the year as projects. So we suggest to make a kind of a project template where you write down your ideas, what you're going to do, and also get the buy-in from the cross-functional partners, and then start doing it. Just quickly to understand what are the levers. Volume bundling, lever number 1, right? Trying to get more insights or more better prices from more volume. A rule of thumb says double the volume, 3% discount. This is of course very roughly, but normally it's clear the more you buy, the better the prices are getting. How are you going to do this? One possibility, supplier reduction, right? The other day we had the case of a company which had, thanks to several mergers, in one commodity group, 54 suppliers, similar suppliers for the same thing. This is not necessary, right? Then there was a big project, actually 2 master students spent there one after the other till we had finally analyzed all of this, because you have to see which of these 54 are actually compatible to each other, which materials are similar, and then start a reduction, supply reduction program, driving it down in that case to only 6 suppliers. This is still enough competition, but with 54 for none of them you are important. So they will not treat you well, and with none you get a good price. So that is supplier reduction, a typical exercise which happens. Then bundling with brands, regions, that means other parts of your company. You optimize the ongoing series. This is an interesting purchasing trick. You make a contract now, but if you have serial production and something runs for 3, 4, 5 years, then you can tell your supplier, hey, for you to get the new volume for the next generation contract, I expect also that in the ongoing contract, where you are the only supplier, we get some savings, some discount, right? Because the supplier wants to be in the next generation business as well. Therefore, maybe you're willing to give you also a price discount on an ongoing old product where normally you would have a very bad power position, right? Because once a supplier is embedded in your serial production, there's a big likelihood that it continues because there's a learning curve. Nobody else will be able to produce it for the same price as the one who starts first of all. Now, this is the bundling exercise here. And so on. You can make a package. This is also very popular. If you have some commodity which is not popular, then you put it together with more attractive products, right? Price evaluation, and there are much more, right? I just highlighted here some of them, but next one, price evaluation. Of course, you may request technical alternatives which are cheaper. You make a recalculation, you make a cost breakdown, you take out each element. If you buy I don't say office set for a new employee, they need a printer, a laptop and a monitor and maybe a mouse. You can calculate the price of each of them individually, put this together and discuss with the supplier who hopefully delivers all of this to you at once to give you the optimal price as if you were buying them all alone. Target price. That is what we said before. You make workshops. That's what we can pay. Let's look for solutions how to achieve this for a certain price. Of course, here with the price evaluation, we all have these instruments of renegotiation, auctions, charging, new prices, etc., etc. Expanding of supply base. We already discussed this. Global sourcing plays here a role. Or the other way around, what we call deep localization. That is, if you are a multinational company, you may also replace international suppliers with local ones. Sometimes it's also cheaper. And last but not least, I would like to highlight here that expansion of supply base can also be with your existing suppliers. You can ask them to produce something which they have not done before, and hence they become a supplier in a category to which they have not delivered beforehand. Product optimization. We already discussed about this. Early involvement in development teams, develop a new product, cheaper, better one, which may change the material. This is very thankful. Many new materials are being brought to the market constantly. So try them out. Then you can run a concept competition. That's quite an interesting tool. In the concept competition, the buyer or the buying company is not exactly specifying what they want, but just ask for a solution. Case at hand, my favorite case is the one of the firefighting equipment. So it was a chemical company which wanted to build a new storage to store some chemicals in it. And normally what they would have done is they would have designed how this building should look like. And then they would have made a request for quotation for firefighting equipment companies like sprinklers or mobile firefighters, etc., etc. But what they did was they said, okay, we make a concept competition. We just tell to the world, this is our situation. This is the size of the hall. That is the materials which is in it. And we don't want that it burns down. Please find a solution. And the solution was not to install a lot of firefighting equipment. But one company said, okay, this material does not burn if it has too little oxygen in the air. So we suggest to simply reduce the oxygen, then it cannot burn, and then you do not need any firefighting equipment. And this is much cheaper. Yeah, so that's what they did. The insurance company bought this, accepted it. You see it more often nowadays. but that is a result of a concept competition, right? Asking for improving the product. And last but not least, technical simplification. Often products are too complicated, right? As Saint-Exupéry has said, perfection is not when there is nothing left to add, but then when there is nothing left to take away. That's exactly what technical simplification is all about. And that is very often a purchaser has to do so because of the interest of reducing costs. Process optimization, here capacity planning, joint planning with the supplier, quality conversation. For example, you avoid incoming quality inspections. If your supplier is reliable and makes an outgoing quality control, in principle, you do not need to have an incoming quality control. So that is something you discuss here. You can also optimize logistics, implement, for example, a milk run. That means that your vehicle is going from one supplier to the next and always picking up their materials. This is sometimes cheaper than each of them sending a small quantity in their own van to your factory, right? Many possibilities, optimization of logistics. Then the relationship. Here you may do supply development. This is a term you should remember. Supplier development means that the buyer helps the supplier to get better. Why? Well, both can profit with that. So this, however, requires a good relationship, right? That's why it is a lever with relationship management. You can become a preferred customer. We are going to discuss this in a moment, but some companies have implemented an entire program with this. If they have a good customer status, then the supplier is willing to engage in innovation projects, cost breakdown will be opened, and this kind of joint optimization can take place. Or you may include new non-standard contrasts like gain sharing models and the like. And of course, the cross-commodity optimization. This is the last lever to discuss. We already talked this. Can you find savings by maybe jointly buying something with another commodity? The other way around, try to not be egoistic and provoke costs by your savings at another point. That's why the cross-commodity lever is in the end. Okay. Just summarizing this, there are a lot of such tools. So I hope it becomes also clear that purchasing requires planning. It is much more than just asking for offers and taking the cheapest one. Sometimes with spot purchases, when you do not have enough time or energy or knowledge, that might be the way to do it. And if it's not so expensive and you only buy it once, then you just ask for some offers from suppliers which you have identified and take the cheapest one. But in most cases, this is not so easy to do. So you have to be creative, find a lot of ideas. And this is here a collection of how to create these ideas. Commercial leverage, using advantage, such as finding more volume, hard negotiation, new suppliers, or cross-functional, sitting together with experts to improve the product, the process, or to make a better relationship, a better contract, which is incentivizing both parties. Now, coming to the last point here, which is the preferred customer status. This is an advanced topic. I would not argue, I would say last not least, we added it here because you can run a company, maybe you survive, but you may not be too successful. And sometimes it can even be killing you, such as in that case here. I would like to introduce this idea, and this is part of your strategic positioning, your strategic planning, if you want to embed this in the year cycle. Take these two aeroplanes, the A340 and the B777. 340 just sold 377 units. Bad luck that it ended in 77 because the competitor 777 was much more successful. Now, why did this happen? And I must confess that I'm very unhappy about this because my favorite plane is the A340-600. It used to have in the body, it's an intercontinental plane, and in the body there it used to go downstairs the stairs, right? And then you would have a unit with several toilets, so you would not have to queue. And they also had a small bar next to this. So if in the middle of the night in your overseas flight you got thirsty, you could go there and get something to drink. Very convenient, very nice, also very silent display, but it has the disadvantage is it was consuming too much fuel. And that's why also, for example, with Lufthansa, the first plane they took out of service in the Corona affair was the A340. Now, why is this plane such a failure? Why do I tell you this story? It has to do with supplier relations of not being a preferred customer. So we ask ourselves the questions like, why does this one have 4 turbines and that one only 2? 2 turbines may consume less power, less fuel than 4. And this is actually true. But why didn't Airbus then use this design? And here is an interesting insight on that. And I'll read it, quote, "The problem we have with GE is that they go to Boeing in Seattle and say, what kind of engine should we design for your airframe?" said Airbus Chief Operating Officer. Now, that is they're talking about the relation towards the producer of turbines, which is the supplier, right? The supplier. And this supplier apparently treats Boeing as preferred customer and asked them, how should we develop our turbine? And jointly they develop it. And then, you just go further, and once they have developed it in the way how Boeing wants it, then they come to Airbus in Toulouse and say, here is the kind of airframe you need to build to fit our engine, right? So they ask to build all around. Remember the case of the tires and the citation here in the introduction of the Volkswagen case. Exactly, this is done by purpose. They define how a tire has to look like. And the other car companies have to figure out what is the driving unit which they can use because they need to buy these tires. And the same problem happened here to Airbus. And then they tried out another thing, another producer of engines. It did not work out well, right? And this is exactly the point here. Often suppliers are having the key technology. The suppliers are on the driving seat. And if you as a buying company, such as Boeing in this case, get into the position of being a preferred supplier, you get a lot of advantages. And if you're not, difficult situation. Let's look at this a little bit more in detail. How to become a preferred customer. Now, that's obviously what we want to do in the end. You need to be basically attractive. You need to have satisfied suppliers. This is something new. People in the past did not really think so much about this. That's why I say it is an advanced topic which we are discussing here. You will not find this in most standard textbooks. In the meantime, a few more have appeared, right, next to this yellow book from 1957. Now, coming back to this, you need to have satisfied suppliers, because if just put yourself in the mind of a supplier, if the supplier is always having trouble with your company, and then you come there as purchaser and say, hey, I need a better price, a better conditions, and you have to deliver faster. And at the other moment comes the purchasing agent from a company which is running very well, which is always supportive to you, which has a good planning system, etc. Whom are you going to give the first call? Whom are you going to give the best prices, and whom are you more willing to collaborate with, right? It's a rhetorical question, but that's why preferred supply satisfaction is important. And your status as a preferred customer. There have been about 70 papers up till now which try to understand this phenomenon and try to ultimately select solutions. Now, if we look at a field of knowledge, how it develops, then we typically see, first of all, we need to have a phenomenon. In this case, we see the phenomenon that customers are treated differently by suppliers. Then we need to understand what are the implications: innovation, delivery, special benefits. Then we need to understand the antecedents. Why is it happening? How are we going to, or how are we becoming, in that case, a preferred customer? Then, if we know all of this, we can make some tools to make it happen. And last but not least, there may be some contingencies. It may be different in the public than in the private environment, with direct or indirect materials, and so on. Let's transfer this logic here. This is the development of a field for whatever type of field. Of course, not always these arrows work in this direction, but this is how it logically could be. And here is a picture. It may look complicated in the beginning, but it's not. Let's start. What is the phenomenon? Well, that's what we have been measuring here before. We've measured this with at least 20 companies. You can measure supply satisfaction. Sometimes a company has very satisfied suppliers, sometimes not, and they award preferred customer or not. So we asked suppliers to evaluate this. Consequences: preferential treatment, right? Why do we do all of this? We want to be getting the best engine. Think about the Airbus case. We want to be delivered, for example, in the COVID moment when supply chains collapse. Who gets the last material, right? That's the preferred customer. So these are the implications. Innovations, collaboration with innovation. With whom are we going to collaborate? Innovation is a risky business. Not everybody wants to do this automatically, right? So that is the implications. Antecedents are these here. I'm not going into details. Just you should know about the growth, profitability, relation, and operative excellence. Companies which are growing are more attractive for the seller. Profitability, quite fair. Good relationship, we already discussed this. And operative excellence, if the buying company is chaos, nobody wants to work with them. And in this model here, Fawcett 2016, there are even some contingencies, difference between direct and indirect procurement. Now, this is one of these models, how to measure, how to assess preferred customer status, and providing evidence that it's a real phenomenon and that you can benefit from this. The last and very last point here, which will also be our last few slides, is so what to do? How can you use this knowledge as purchasing? First of all, you can draw another matrix, not only the Kraljic-matrix, but the preferred customer matrix. On the one axis, you would try to assess your status with your suppliers. Do they like you? Are you important for them or not? Right? Here there are some criteria which you can use for that. similar technology, you are commercially important, culturally similar, etc., etc. You try to make this assessment. It works more or less self-assessment. Of course, you can also ask your supplier, but then it should be in an anonymous way. You will not get this back for an individual supplier. And at the other axis, you look at the competitiveness of the supplier. Some are good, some are bad. And out of this comes the preferred customer matrix. So the nicest situation is you are sure that the supplier treats you as preferred customer. And it's a very important, very good supplier. By the way, this competitiveness, normally companies can judge by themselves. So no tools here. Well, if you are a preferred customer and the supplier is good, then we call the situation the king's situation. You can collaborate, you can achieve competitive advantage. Now, a bad situation is that one here, the Black Knight. Yeah, this is from these medieval films where you have the White Knight and the Black Knight. The Black Knight is typically dangerous because clever, but malicious, and you don't want it. Yeah, that's exactly here the metaphor for this situation of the Black Knight, that supplier is good, but does not really consider you a preferred customer. Try to avoid these type of suppliers because they first are going to support your competitor, and this is strategically problematic. Example is with the mobile phones. There were some models from Apple which contained parts from Samsung, right? And this is exactly a problem because the more these parts were sold, the more Samsung, which is also a direct competitor in the final product, gets stronger and sells more. So this is a typical Black Knight situation. You better want to go out of this. If your competitor is, for example, linked to the supplier, and the worst case by owning it, right? That is the worst case scenario. Avoiding. Another type of supplier to avoid is the so-called quacksalver. Neither likes you nor is it good. Why the hell is this type of company showing up in your matrix here when you place the individual suppliers here? Please notice that in the Kraljic-matrix, you place the commodities in it. Furniture, I don't know, power, fuel, furniture, electrical, yeah. And here you place the individual suppliers because it's an individual, what a supplier likes about you or not. This depends on this buyer-supplier relationship. That's why the suppliers are present here. Now, if you have a supplier which does not like you and is bad, like this medieval quacksalvers, which were selling some kind of drugs on markets and were going from town to town because the drugs did not work, and so they had to go before someone complains. That's a quacksalver. And this type of supplier, again and again, when you run this model with a company, surprisingly you find them. Then people don't know why they are there, but often they have a certain story and so on, right? But get rid of them. And the squire in the end here, if you are a Star Wars fan, think about a Padawan, the kind of helping or apprentice. And here they like your company, you are a preferred customer, but the competitiveness is not so good. That's where it's worth to invest in supplier development. Help this supplier to be better, because then it turns into this king category. Then you are happy. And last but not least, you say, okay, what can I do to be more attractive? Because I don't have too many kings, maybe a couple of Black Knights. 3 suggestions. Based on this research, we saw that growing buyers are considered to be more attractive for sellers than those which are declining. This is quite straightforward. If you are in fear that you're, in the worst case, your customer is going bankrupt, you will not deliver. But if you're sure that this is the company of the future which is going up, then you as a buyer, as a seller, want to be sell to this company. Now, as if you are a buyer, tell this to your suppliers. Tell them that your company is going to grow. What are your plans for growth? And how much have you been growing in the past? This is also another reason for this. Often they stay for much longer time as in a sales position than in the purchaser's position. So the seller often has a long time horizon. If he's doing a good business with a customer which is growing, automatically the seller will match his sales targets. That's another reason why a growing company is really attractive. And what we ask is, change your mind as a purchaser. You are not the one where people are queuing in front of the door. Sometimes this may be happening. But if you go to them, try to be attractive, tell them the right stories, then they will bring you the advantages. And that's a new job for the purchaser, which is a game changer. Imagine that you act like this and your competitor is old-fashioned, arrogant, and unreliable. And that's what's happening here. Relational behavior. What does this mean? We made a survey, anonymous, and about 1/4 of the responding purchasers admitted that from time to time they are not completely honest towards their supplier. According to our research, this is not very helpful because it will become known in any way, and then it fights back. A relational behavior is something which you can influence, often much more than other things. I mean, if your company is growing or not, that is not what you directly influence as individual purchasers. But the relational behavior, being supportive, reliable, and so on, and not opportunistic, this is something which tends to be very important for suppliers. They in all surveys they indicate that this is important. Morally impeccable behavior. That is like this theater play of Goethe. Remember the guy with the very old, simple vicary auction? Iphigenia, she tries to be morally impeccable, and that is exactly what, according to customer research, is also beneficial for the supplier, for the buyer to do. And last point, but not least, operative excellence. This is often forgotten. If you do not pay on time, there's no excuse that you say that your bank did not do it or that your computer was broken or whatever. Feeling with many suppliers is that, it does not treat me well. I'm not important for this company, and they will reciprocate this type of behavior. So it makes also sense to invest in good systems, for example, in IT systems, even though they do not appear to have an immediate return. But operative excellence is one important point, and we see this again and again, and I repeat myself, I've done 20 such analysis here. Few companies know what the suppliers think about them, but they should know and should try to change their behavior. And every time this operative excellence is significant, it's when we ask the supplier about the companies. If they work better, if they have better operative systems, don't let the supplier wait, accurate documents, good forecast, etc., etc. That really helps and will pay back, supplier satisfied and likes to work with you. Well, this is the end after 2 hours of our tour d'horizon in a very big or a very short, very big steps. We went through some key features which might important to know when you join a course, or when you join the purchasing department, or just simply when you are trying to understand a little bit better what your colleagues in the purchasing department do or should be doing. Right? We have seen it has not historically been so relevant, but this has completely changed. 70% of the costs are purchasing costs. Hence, companies exist selling, but earn profits by buying. Remember some important aspects here: direct materials, indirect materials, right? The direct materials disappear in the project. Also consider the diverse purchasing situations and roles. For example, the operative purchaser or operative procurement, the purchaser for direct material, for indirect material, or this novel role of the procurement engineer or the advanced sourcer. So this is important. Then you look at the cycle of purchasing, the commodity cycle with identifying the supplier, making a planning, the strategy, identifying supplier, contracting, executing, and evaluating. And the department cycle, which links the purchasing department and its actors to the company, which is very much emphasizing the planning, the support to the corporate strategy, and the plans on that. For that purpose, you obviously need to adjust your structure, your organization, your IT systems. And again, this helps you to learn or to become better next year again. So this is the cycle of purchasing. We could say two elements: the department cycle and the commodity manager cycle. Then we look at a few theories which can help, and some tools such as the Kraljic-matrix, distinguishing between these four categories: the bottleneck suppliers, which you don't want, the categories, alias bottleneck categories which you do not want to have because you need them, but they are strong. You prefer the leverage type where you are strong and suppliers need your volume. We have looked at the lever analysis, right? How to achieve cost savings by reducing the prices, or by reducing the cost through improvement of the product and things like that. And finally, we concluded here with the preferred customer idea as an advanced topic, which not everybody knows. The Kraljic-matrix, most purchasers know, but the preferred customer, that is still something where you can differentiate yourself and your company. Well, I wish you a good luck with this. And we come to an end. If you have questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and good luck, especially then.